It's a real privilege to be here. So we're going to look at the question, are humans unique? What is it about us? Is there anything special that means what it is to be a human being? What exactly are we? And in order to think about the question of human uniqueness, we do need to think about what we actually are. Are we just advanced apes that have climbed to the top of the food chain? Are we souls that will one day escape the confines of the body and float off to some higher existence? Are we machines? Are we purely material beings that will one day be replicated and superseded? And of course, there are many different answers to this question in the world at the moment, and how we answer this question has actually huge implications, and not least for the area of healthcare. What is the nature of the person in front of you, whether that is in the GP surgery, on the ward, in the operating room? What we actually believe a human being is vastly impacts how we care for a person, how we treat them, and how we educate them. Perhaps we can agree that when it comes to uniqueness, certainly one quality that distinguishes us from most other creatures is that we are conscious beings. We do extraordinary things. We create poetry, we write philosophy, we invent technology, we dance and sing, we laugh, we fall in love, we grieve the loss of loved ones, we contemplate our own existence. And though a small number of other animal species are doing some of these some of the time, no other species is doing all of them all of the time. Perhaps René Descartes, the philosopher, was right when he said that the aspect of humanity that we know with most certainty is that we are conscious. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. We have a sense of self. We have a point of view. Now, part of my own story is that although I came to faith later on and I wasn't raised in a Christian home, I remember sitting by a window as a child, watching rain splash against the pane, and suddenly a series of questions came to mind. Why can I think? Why do I exist? Why am I a living, breathing, conscious human being? It's as though I had an awareness of my own consciousness. We are conscious beings, or as the philosopher Thomas Nagel once put it, there is something that it is like to be you. There is something that it is like to be you. Now, where does this unique quality come from? Where does human consciousness come from? Now, one perspective that we will find out there, and that perhaps you come across quite often, is that actually we're unique because of our superior brains. Nick Bostrom, a philosophy professor and former director of the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford, said, inside your cranium is the thing that does the reading. This thing, the human brain, has some capabilities that the brains of other animals lack. It is to these distinctive capabilities that we owe our dominant position on the planet. Now, it's true that there are some very clear differences between humans and animals. We don't have the largest brains. We leave that to the sperm whale and the elephant with their 10-kilogram brains compared with our measly 1.3 kilos sitting inside of our skulls. But humans have by far the largest ratio of brain weight to body weight, which is why babies have these enormous heads lolling around that you're trying to kind of support. And we have the most developed cerebral cortex. And we have the highest neuronal density as well, somewhere in the realm of 100 billion neurons. Clearly, the human brain is significant and extraordinary. But here's the question: is the human brain alone sufficient to explain human consciousness and therefore human uniqueness? And of course, many brilliant scientists seem to think so. We could look at Professor Sir Colin Blakemore, the late professor, late emeritus professor of neuroscience at Oxford University, who said that the human brain is a machine which alone accounts for all of our actions, our most private thoughts, our beliefs. All our actions are the product of the activity of our brains. Or Steven Pinker, he's a Harvard psychologist, and in Time magazine in 2007, he wrote this: consciousness does not reside in an ethereal soul that uses the brain like a PDA, a personal digital assistant. Consciousness is the activity of the brain. Scientists have amassed evidence that every aspect of consciousness can be tied to the brain. And so this is a popular view out there, and we probably have encountered it in our field as well. And this question is highly relevant as we look to the future. If human consciousness is purely material, then in theory, one day it could be generated artificially. And with the arrival in the last few years of large language models of AI, like ChatGPT and Google's Gemini and Anthropic's Claude, it increasingly feels like we are talking to a person rather than a set of algorithms. And so will human levels of consciousness eventually be possible in machines? Well, the philosopher John Searle actually a long time ago developed a thought experiment to think about this, and it still holds today, even though we're dealing with vastly more sophisticated models. And he called it the Chinese room, and he used it to argue that just because an algorithm appears to be conscious, just because it's passing what's known as the Turing test and it appears to be conscious, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is conscious. And he asks us to imagine this scenario. Imagine a person outside a closed room passing Chinese messages to someone else inside the closed room. Now, the person inside the closed room does not speak Chinese. All they have learnt to do is interpret the message coming in. They've got a book to do that, to figure out what the message is, to work out a response and to send that back out. Now, to the person outside, it looks like the person inside can speak Chinese. But that is not the case. All they have learned to do is process Chinese characters. And Searle's point is this, that the ability to process information, even if that is in an incredibly accurate and sophisticated way, that is not the same thing as having a conscious self, an inner life, an inner reality. And this still holds even if the algorithm is pulling from extremely large data sets, the data sets that it now is, and is outputting responses that haven't even been programmed by a human. That's a phrase that philosophers refer to as machine learning, which again sounds like such a human quality, but it's actually, it's still crunching data. And so artificial intelligence and human consciousness are still two very different things. Just because AI appears to be conscious doesn't necessarily mean that it is conscious. And as the philosopher Philip Goff said, ChatGPT is an unfeeling mechanism that has been trained on huge amounts of human-made data to generate content that seems like it was written by a person. It doesn't consciously understand the meaning of the words it's spitting out. If thought means the act of conscious reflection, then ChatGPT has no thoughts about anything. Interesting. And of course, an ongoing question for many in the room will be what will be the role, or what is the role of AI in healthcare? You know, AI has the ability to increase diagnostic speed and accuracy. For example, we could think about radiology, looking at scans, be that X-ray or CT or MRI, to make a diagnosis about something. Now, a human doctor, a human radiologist, reads between 100 and 250 scans a day. whereas AI has the potential to read thousands of scans every minute. And of course, AI is reading each scan against a vastly greater database than even the most experienced radiologist with a whole lifetime of expertise behind them. And so perhaps AI can have some sort of beneficial role in lots of different areas of healthcare. But then there are also people consulting ChatGPT instead of chatting to their GP. Do we want this to happen? You know, is that a good thing? I don't know. You guys are the experts on that. But there are lots of questions to be wrestled with in terms of what is the role of AI in healthcare. So moving on with how we might go about thinking more about what it means to be a human being. It might help us to define what we mean by a few of the terms that I'm thinking about today. These definitions are from the Oxford English Dictionary. And I guess actually this very slide is the answer to the question, are you just your brain? No, because you also have a mind and you are conscious. You have a brain with its with its neurons and white and grey matter and synapses and chemicals and so on. And then you have a mind. You have thoughts, feelings, emotions, memories. And of course, you experience the world. You are conscious. There's a first-person experience that you have, which is not unrelated to your mind. And actually, mind and consciousness are kind of overlapping concepts. And for the purposes of this discussion, they're kind of synonymous. Some people might say that consciousness is a property of the mind. And the question at the heart of this whole conversation is this: can non-conscious neurons generate conscious humans? Because for people that want to say everything that is to be conscious comes from the brain, they have to answer this question. How is it that non-conscious neurons generate conscious humans? How do you get from neurons to thoughts? How do you get from brain chemistry inside your skull to what it is like to be you? Is it even possible? And of course, this is not a new question. Sometimes we can be under the impression that theologians and philosophers are scrabbling around for answers to this question in the light of AI and rising technologies and scientific theories. But actually, this is an ancient question that's been debated since the ancient world. It was the mind-body problem back in the day, and now it's the it was the body-soul problem, and now it's the mind-brain problem. David Chalmers coined the term the hard problem of consciousness. How you explain and get from brain cells, neurons, to conscious humans is really hard. and so he coined the term the hard problem of consciousness. And the perspective driving some of this discussion is essentially saying that mind and brain are the same thing. That mental states are brain states. Mental processes are brain processes. These are just synonymous. The mind, if you like, is reducible to the physical processes in the brain, which is why it's sometimes referred to as reductive physicalism. And this view actually has significant implications for everyday life. Because if we are just our brains, then every thought that we have, every opinion that we express, every decision that we make is not actually coming from us, it's coming from forces beyond our control inside our skull. And if that is true, then what do our thoughts and opinions even mean if they're not ours as such? They're simply our brains. We're just the bearer of them. We just deliver them to the outside world. This was brought home to me when I gave a talk in a school, and I'd been, sharing this perspective, and at the end a student put their hand up and said that they didn't believe that there was free will. Because if we are just our brains, then do we just do what they tell us? Are we actually free at all? And I said to this student, well, what do you want me to do with your question? Because if your philosophy is true, your question means nothing. It's not coming from you. It's not your question. It's coming from forces beyond your control inside your skull. And you're just the conduit. But if you want me to take your question seriously, your philosophy fails. Because you want me to assume you are the bearer of that viewpoint. You see, we seem to live as though people are the bearer of their opinions. Boy, do we have opinions, and we want them to be taken seriously, right? And our actions. We live, we reward good behavior, we punish bad. We award degrees and medals on the basis that the person, not their brain, took the exam. Imagine the outrage if we started to live by the philosophy that you are just your brain. No one would get any degree. There would be no doctors. That would be a terrible world. So surely the brain can't be the whole story. Now, what the science has shown is that mind and brain are connected. If you put someone on an MRI scanner and you give them an activity to do that uses their mind, for example, their working memory, you ask them to sort of memorize 5 items on a list. You're sort of using your mental notepad. What you will see is that networks in the brain light up in response. And so clearly mind and brain are connected. They're very closely connected. But the error that is made is just because they're connected doesn't necessarily mean they're identical. That is not necessarily the case. I'll come back to that point in a minute. Let me just try and explain a little bit more about why physical descriptions alone are not enough to capture experience in the world. Are you a coffee drinker? I'm a coffee drinker. Imagine that materialism is the correct worldview and all we have at our disposal are physical descriptions. The forces of nature acting on matter. So describe to me the smell of coffee. What would you say? I mean, you might offer me the chemical structure of the volatile compounds in coffee. Be very beautiful. I mean, I loved biochemistry. I loved that stuff. But it doesn't get you any closer to the smell of coffee. Or you might offer me the physiology of it as you drink it and digest it. Beautiful. But doesn't get you any closer to the smell of coffee. If you want to understand the smell of coffee, if you want to encounter the smell of coffee, what do you need to do? To smell it. There's actually no other way of experiencing that. And this is an example in the singular of a quail, which is not as in the eggs, in the plural, qualia. And qualia are qualitative experiences that are impossible to describe physically. And life is full of qualia, and the biggest, most significant qualia of all is the qualitative experience of what it is to be you. Just to drive it home a little bit more. Imagine we wanted to do a study to find out what it's like for you to go through a week in your life. And we attach an EEG cap to you, and we collect some really interesting data from the surface of your scalp. We pop you in an MRI scanner, we take some structural scans, we take some functional scans. We collect some really interesting, beautiful and elegant data from your brain. Will that tell us what it's like for you to go through a week in your life? Of course not. We can take all the objective measurements from your brain that we like. It won't tell us what it's like to be you. To access your mind, you have to choose to reveal that to us. And for this reason, there are many agnostics and atheists as well as Christians that believe that mind and brain are two very different things. We are not just our brains because we have a mind. And the mind is so different in every aspect to the human brain. Brains don't think. People think using their brains. And there are actually better ways of describing human beings and accounting for human uniqueness than simply viewing everything through the lens of the brain. And very quickly, some alternative ways of thinking about the mind-brain relationship. One thing is to say that the mind emerges from the brain, that somehow when a number of component parts come together, something new comes into being that isn't reducible to physics and chemistry, and that's an interesting view, although they still run up against the hard problem. Just because you put the word emerge there, or that the brain generates the mind, that doesn't change the hard problem. How do non-conscious neurons generate consciousness? Still the same problem. Another viewpoint is to say that the mind is beyond the brain. This view is saying there are two types of substance, that the brain is a physical substance and the mind is a non-physical substance. And these two things interact. They are distinct, but they interact very closely, and it's referred to as substance dualism. And another perspective is to say, actually, we haven't got very far by starting with the building blocks of the brain and trying to explain human consciousness. So why don't we flip that on its head and assume that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe and try and build a case from there. And that's where you get panpsychism from the Greek, pan meaning all and psyche meaning soul. This view would say that there is consciousness in every aspect of the world, in living systems and in non-living systems, even down to the atomic scale. There is something that it is like to be an electron or a quark, or some forms of panpsychism would say that. And see, these are alternative ways of trying to think about these views that I say a lot more about in my book, Am I Just My Brain? But the important thing to say that isn't always obvious to people, that each of these views that I've looked at very briefly, in terms of what the science can show you, they're empirically neutral, they're empirically equivalent, because all the science can show you is connection, that mind and brain are connected. The nature of the connection takes you out of the realm of science into philosophy. And these are philosophical positions. But you can't actually, there is no scientific study you can do to demonstrate any one of these. But they're all supported by the science, one way or another. Now, what about neuroscience? When we begin to look at actual people, what sort of things do we see? Now, I'm aware that I'm speaking to an audience that has far more expertise in these kinds of areas than I actually do. But it seems to be that most of the time, conscious states and brain states work in parallel. They are closely correlated. We see this in fetal development and in infant development. As the brain grows and develops, they grow in conscious awareness. Or we could look at brain injury or brain trauma. When someone has a trauma to the brain, this can impact their conscious mind in some cases. And of course, we could look at neurodegenerative disease, that as the person's brain deteriorates, then the person's conscious mind also deteriorates in parallel. So most of the time, we see continuity between brain states and conscious states. But occasionally, there are some interesting aspects of discontinuity, creating a bit more of a complex picture. Now, one example is adult survivors of hydrocephalus. There are a small number of adults walking this earth who have survived water on the brain, who have the vast majority of their brain tissue missing. The CT scan on the left shows you a healthy brain, and the one in the middle and on the right show you a patient that has survived hydrocephalus. And of course, I know that there are all kinds of theories about, if compression takes place very gradually over time, then actually it's just that the cortex is being compressed and function can be retained. I know that is how people make sense of it. But even so, it's quite a lot of brain to be missing and still be a normal, functioning adult. It certainly gives us pause for thought, if nothing else, that we sometimes see a more complex picture. And then there is the field of near-death experiences. when the brain dies, what happens to the mind? You see, since the 1960s, since resuscitation abilities became used, a significant number of people have been resuscitated from being, their heart had stopped beating, usually in cardiac arrest. The heart stopped beating for sufficiently long that it's very likely that, cortical activity had ceased as well. And yet, when resuscitated, some patients were recounting being vividly conscious during that time when they were in a state of, clinical death. Now, I'm also aware that in your CMF files that you get regularly, there's been a recent publication on brain death, how we might define it, what the implications are for patient care, and it also highlighted that there are different kinds of death, and this is obviously complex and nuanced. And I guess NDEs in particular are looking at instances of cortical death, where cerebral activity has ceased, or is likely to have ceased. And of course, the prevailing view is that if the cortex has shut down, that should be the end of consciousness. And yet, of course, over the last 65 years, we have occasionally heard a different story, and NDEs there have been a number of systematic studies. The world's largest NDE study was published in 2014, led by Dr. Sam Parnia, who was based at Southampton University when the study began, and by the end he was at Stony Brook University in New York. This was a prospective study where participants were identified at their point of entry rather than being retrospectively interviewed afterwards, after a cardiac arrest, whether they had had any sort of experience. There were 101 people who actually went on to be interviewed after their recovery from cardiac arrest. And 46% had mental recollections that were not consistent with NDEs, so they weren't counted, but 9% had experiences that were consistent with NDEs, and 2% described awareness with explicit recall of seeing and hearing actual events related to their resuscitation, and 1 had a verifiable period of conscious awareness during which time cerebral function was not expected. My position is that I hold NDEs fairly lightly. I don't see them as proof of God or as proof of heaven. But even for one person, even if there is only one genuine instance of somebody saying that they were vividly conscious, even when there was no expected cerebral activity, that is not the kind of thing you would expect to find if you are just your brain. And for that reason, I think they're fascinating. I think they're really interesting. And some have actually radically changed their view based on the very nature, their view of what a human being is based on their own NDE. I don't know if you've come across former Harvard neurosurgeon Dr. Eben Alexander, who actually, prior to having his own NDE, he was a strict physicalist. He'd operated on patients and they'd said to him they'd had NDEs, and he didn't believe them because if you don't have a functioning cortex, you can't be conscious. Until he developed severe bacterial meningitis at the age of 54, went into a coma. His whole neocortex had shut down. He was not expected to survive. His family were told to put their affairs in order. And yet he went on to make a full recovery against the odds, and recounted an extremely vivid conscious experience, and said in his book, Proof of Heaven, "My experience showed me that the death of the body and the brain are not the end of consciousness, that human experience continues beyond the grave." And I guess, why would you say that and change? He's not a Christian, but he's definitely not a physicalist anymore. And why would you make that change, especially when to not be a physicalist, I think, is quite unpopular amongst Harvard neurosurgeons. Why would you do that unless you actually believe what happened to you was very real and vivid and genuine? So at the very least, I think that clinical research there are a few instances that highlight that this is complex. This is more complex than simply chalking everything down to the activity of the brain alone. And some with a lifetime of experience have actually drawn some very interesting conclusions. Wilder Penfield, the founder of the Montreal Neurological Institute, known for his treatment of epilepsy patients and the mapping of the human cortex, towards the end of his life wrote honestly about his views about the human makeup. And he said, "For my own part, after years of striving to explain the mind on the basis of brain action alone, I've come to the conclusion that it is simpler and far easier to be logical if one adopts the hypothesis that our being does consist of two fundamental elements." Very interesting for someone to say that right at the end of their life. And then Michael Egnor, a professor of neurosurgery at Stony Brook University in New York, who after 30 years of patient interaction has said, "Materialism, the view that matter is all that exists, is the premise of much contemporary thinking about what a human being is. And yet, evidence from the laboratory, the operating room, and clinical experience points to a less fashionable conclusion. Human beings straddle the material and immaterial realms." Fascinating. Such an interesting perspective, especially when we're thinking about things like, what will the future hold with AI and healthcare? If human beings are just physical, then in theory they could be replicated artificially. One day maybe there will be conscious androids walking the streets of your city. But if human beings are more than physical, then even though AI will continue to grow in accuracy and efficiency and speed and comprehensivity and outstrip humans in many areas, there will still be something unique and irreplaceable about human beings. And the implications also for neurodegenerative disease. There are many different areas of patient care. If a person is just a material being, then as their brain and body deteriorates, then the person gradually is fading. But if they are more than just their brain, then even as their brain degenerates, the person remains. Perhaps they're even just masked by their neurobiology. And that is a person who is made in the image of God with inherent dignity, somebody known, seen, and loved by God. And of course, when we look at theological perspectives, we also see a similar picture of complexity, that human beings are indeed complex theologically. They're not just dust, they're actually dust and breath. Human beings are integrated physical and spiritual beings. We see this from Genesis 2:7 that says, that the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils a breath of life, and the man became a living being. And the word for breath of life is neshama, or ruach, which is the Hebrew for one of the Hebrew words for spirit. And actually the product of dust and breath is a living nephesh, and that is the Hebrew word for soul. So whatever we mean by soul, in the Hebrew sense, it's an integrated term. It's not simply this part of us that will float off one day, that actually soul is an integrated, holistic term in the Hebrew. We are integrated physical and spiritual beings. And I was going to include a slide there on neurotheology, which is why when people publish data saying what happens in the brain when you pray or meditate, this is not something we need to be afraid of or threatened by. This is simply a reflection that we are integrated physical and spiritual beings. Now, as I draw to a close in my last few minutes, I want to ask a different question. Why is it that we are conscious? Why is it that we have this quality that sets us apart from other species, arguably? You see, even if the scientists come up with an elegant neuroscience of consciousness, even if they come up with lots of beautiful neural correlates, as David Chalmers said, there's a difference between finding a correlate and finding an explanation for why it exists in the first place. You know, there are some questions that science cannot answer and was never intended to answer. Questions like the one I find myself asking as a child, with no religious upbringing at all, no contact with Christian things or philosophical questions. They just arose in me. The interesting thing, I was slightly bored. There were no phones in those days. Do we need to bring back boredom? Why can I think in the first place? And what is the best explanation for why we find ourselves in this universe as conscious, thinking beings? You see, if God does not exist, if actually we do live in a material universe, then somehow human consciousness has arisen from a non-conscious universe. The universe itself is not conscious if there is no God. There is just time plus matter plus chance. But somehow conscious humans have arisen from within that universe. And that's not impossible, but it's surprising, right? But if God does exist, then if you like, conscious humans are exactly what we might expect, because they are entirely consistent with the starting conditions. Because if God exists, then consciousness existed before there was anything physical. In fact, more precisely, a conscious community of Father and Son and Holy Spirit existed before anything physical existed. So we didn't start with chemicals and matter. We started with a conscious being known as God. And that is how you solve the hard problem of consciousness. Actually, the panpsychists are onto something. Maybe consciousness is a fundamental aspect of the universe. But actually, the theist, the Christian theist, can go one step further and say, this is a person that you can actually know. And it's actually through your conscious awareness that we can contemplate our existence and come to know this God. And so why can we think? We think because God thinks. And that's great. And again, that was so helpful to me on my journey to faith that I didn't need to throw my brain out of the window to consider the person of Jesus. Why are we conscious? We're conscious because God is conscious. You know, the very first verse of the Bible says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then the opening verse of John's Gospel, that through the Logos, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. God is not simply energy or a force. He is a conscious being who can be known. And actually he is the ultimate center of consciousness. Yahweh, I am who I am. It doesn't get more centered than that. In other words, the very existence of your conscious mind and mine, the thing that makes us unique or one of, is actually deeply natural to theism, but it is deeply unnatural to materialism. In other words, a case can be made that the very existence of the conscious mind makes more sense if God exists than if he doesn't. Which is why George Val, Nobel laureate in physiology and medicine, said that the stuff of which physical reality is constructed is mind stuff. It is mind that has composed a physical universe. And so are humans unique? A strong case can be made that they are. But the source of our uniqueness is not by found looking within and to our biology, but by looking upwards to the beginning of all things, to God himself. And perhaps the strongest case of all for human uniqueness is that in Jesus, God himself became one. He took on carbon-based life, not silicon-based life. And he lived and died to restore us to God. For in Christ, all the fullness of the deity lives in bodily form. And in doing this, he made it evidently clear that humans have inherent value, dignity, and significance in this world, a uniqueness that neither neuroscience, nor philosophy, nor AI can replace or explain away.
Sharon, thank you very much. That was wonderful. Now, we've got a time for some questions or perhaps conditioned neural responses to your talk.
Okay.
Turning to Slido, a nice easy one to begin with. How would you explain the difference between mind and soul?
Oh, yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the question. So I think that what I want to say about the soul is what we definitely don't mean by the soul is this immaterial and immortal part of you that one day will float off to heaven. That view comes more from Greek Platonism than from a biblical view of what the soul is. In terms of what happens at death, our model is the resurrection, and Jesus was bodily raised from the dead, and those that follow him, he's the forerunner on our behalf. And of course there were supernatural, there was continuity and discontinuity between his resurrected body and his earthly body. And I think soul is a concept that is used in different ways, but in general in the Bible it's a very holistic term, as I mentioned in the Genesis verse. There are obviously parts of the Bible where it's referred to, like, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And these are not different philosophical views on the human makeup. Those verses mean give God everything. They're actually a measure of extent. So sometimes soul is even used to give God everything that you have. And these are all, heart, soul, mind, strength are all different ways that the Bible uses to refer to the inner person, this inner self that can't be captured by looking at your physicality alone. And I think that there are some that would say that the soul, they would make it a bit more concrete than that, and they would say that the soul, if you like, is the umbrella under which all the different aspects of the person would fit. So someone like Dallas Willard would have said that the soul is like the executive center, the thing that integrates everything else: your rational self, your emotional self, your spiritual self, your intellectual self, and so on. These all are facets of the soul, and maybe he would say that the intellectual mental side of the person is part of the soul.
Brilliant. Now, next one. So what does neurotheology say about hearing voices, hallucination, psychosis, that sort of thing, and perhaps also dementia?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. So neurotheology kind of does what it says on the tin. It's sort of the intersection of neuroscience and theology, where, what happens in the brain when you engage in things that fit more in a theological framework. Mm-hmm. So things like, a fair amount of work has been done at looking at what happens when people pray, and there are different kinds of prayer. People have looked at praying in tongues. People have looked at what you might call, standard Christian prayer. Other people have looked at, Buddhist meditation and so on. And I guess what it tells us is that things happen in the brain. There are different networks and patterns, and obviously many different papers that have been written drawing out different aspects of different kinds of spiritual engagement and the impact that it has on the brain. I mean, I am not an expert on psychosis, but I think that, as I understand it from my very limited experience, that, the kinds of religious sort of propensities that somebody might have under psychosis, they have a different flavour, a different pattern to somebody that is having an authentic religious experience, and that when you treat the psychosis, those experiences go away, whereas an authentic religious experience is not responsive to treatment. That's something that's there regardless. And someone that has psychosis can also have genuine, authentic experiences as well.
And just on the question of dementia, I think you mentioned about this idea of masking, and is the degeneration of the brain in some way masking the person underneath? Is that something you're able to expand on a little?
Yeah, and I think this is a reason why it's so important. The answer that we give to the question, are we just our brains, is so important, because if we are, then the person is degenerating. But is it possible that instead of that being what's happening, that the person themselves is actually just becoming further and further removed from the world? They're sort of masked by the neurobiology. Again, I say that as someone that is obviously, I'm not a neurologist, as you know, and but one thing that makes that very interesting to me is this idea of terminal lucidity that I've heard people referring to, where, very near to the end of life, sometimes there's a return to the self for a few moments, like a person with severe degeneration that can't speak coherently or remember who their family are, suddenly have a moment or a few minutes of lucidity, and that doesn't make any sense if it's all dependent on the brain. But if actually there's still a person there, then is that them just a glimpse of how they will be in the new heaven and new earth shortly before death? I don't know. We even had an instance of my own mum-in-law who actually, very near to the end of her life, had something like this happen to her. We only heard about it through the person that ended up taking her funeral. It turned out that he had met her before, and she'd taken part in a communion service and had prayed the Lord's Prayer and taken communion with very advanced dementia. Couldn't remember even her daughter's name, and her daughter had been going in every day for a long time. Very confused speech, and yet there she was praying and engaging with God. I think we see complexity some of the time, and
complexity is a good word, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll come into the room for a question or two.
Something that's pertinent to me and to some of the transplant surgeons I sometimes work with on intensive care patients. If mind is not an awake brain that I can test and see, should we be doing things like transplant organ harvesting on people who are not cardiac dead? Sorry, I know it's an emotive subject, but it's the reality of what I do.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Gosh, thank you so much for the question. I almost feel not qualified to answer that. I feel like you're the expert, you and your team and those that have spent a whole lifetime in this area working with people know this field far better. I think what we can definitely say as Christians, that our definition of life is much broader than the definition of life that might come from our materialist colleagues that would frame it much more in terms of what the physical body is doing. I don't know if you're aware of some studies also by in the persistent vegetative state as well, that we're able to show signs of mental ability to perform mental tasks even when there were no outward signs of conscious awareness. That was in 2006, so a fair while ago, and I'm sure they've done more since then. But it's certainly, it's not straightforward, but I guess that the Christian framework has a broader definition of what counts as life, and I guess we start there.
Okay, well, let's take another one in the room.
Hi, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I think I'm just thinking aloud, really. Is there an explanation for what happens during general anesthesia? When I had surgery and got GA, and I woke up after, the last thing I remembered was there was just a mask over my nose. Then I woke up and I realized 3 hours had passed. And since then, I've just been wondering what happens on the GA. I've been searching for answers, really, so I'm just curious.
There's a lot of anaesthetists in the room. I don't know if I And one of them is my friend over there. Ben, you should come answer this one. Again, so general anaesthetic is another example of where the vast majority of the time there was continuity and the extraordinary ability, and what a massive blessing to be able to alter the conscious state of a person to perform surgery. It's an example of, again, our understanding of the neurobiology has enabled us to relieve suffering, perform surgery. I don't know if there are instances where, I think there are possibly instances where people have been awake even when being anaesthetized, which again points to the complexity. Maybe it's most of the time there's continuity, sometimes occasionally there's discontinuity. So I would, probably respond in that way. Thank you for the question.
Great, thank you. We'll take one more from Slido, I think, and then we're almost out of time. In fact, there's one that we don't have to answer, but I quite like it. It was something along the lines of, so I guess that uploading my brain into the matrix is not a good idea.
Well, I would just come back to you that assumes that, again, that you are your brain, right? Do you see it in the very wording of the question? If I upload my brain, that I will, it's so deeply ingrained in us that we are just our brains. And we see it all the time when even on, like on this Netflix, there's a series called Brain Games, or we hear, people saying, oh, my brain made me do this. It didn't. You did it. But your brain is the kind of, the mediator of that. So one person, Ian McGilchrist, who you might have come across, he just spent 10 years writing a 2-volume tome that is probably one of the most, is going to be being referred to for many decades, called The Matter with Things. And he puts it like this, there are different models. The brain emits consciousness, the brain transmits consciousness, or the brain permits consciousness. And he's more of the view that the brain permits consciousness, which is interesting.
How do we know that animals don't think? And isn't it just because we can't communicate or understand their language?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is a question that comes up a lot as well. I think that, it does seem to be that certainly the kinds of animals that we interact with have some sort of levels of consciousness. Our household pets have an emotional life. They get scared when there are fireworks. They're happy to see you when you get home. And the question is, well, the difference being compared with humans is they don't have semantic language to express their consciousness. You can tell me about what's in your mind using language. Now, maybe they can do that with each other, but they can't with human beings. And so, but there are some behavioral tests that can be done. For example, if you put a human in front of a mirror, it's called mirror recognition. You put a human in front of a mirror, they know that the reflection is a reflection of them, and that's an indication of being conscious. You have a sense of self. If you put a dog in front of a mirror, they think the reflection is another animal, another dog, and that's an indicator. It's not a guarantee, but there are certain behavioral tests that give you an indication of what's going on internally, that they actually don't necessarily have the same, and that is it possible that, the animal kingdom definitely seems to have an external awareness of its environment and some sort of emotional life, but they don't have the reflexive self-awareness that humans do. They don't climb into their bed at night and say, oh, I had a fight with a cat today. Why am I a dog and not a cat? And I don't know, but again, they don't have language. Now, some species have passed the mirror recognition test. I think some sort of dolphins and things are able to be responsive, but there is still something unique about humans that they pass it in all areas all the time. And of course, it's not a reason to be arrogant in having a session about human uniqueness with being at the, or having kind of being in the position that we are in the created order comes with it a sense of responsibility to care for the animal kingdom and the natural world in the areas of ecology and environmental care and biodiversity and all of these areas. So it's not a reason to sit back and be complacent, but to
Great. Thank you very
brush
much.
up our sleeves.
One final question. In terms of looking into these things in more depth, clearly there's an excellent book called Am I Just My Brain by Dr. Sharon Dirckx.
Don't know.
So that would be a good place to start. Would you recommend any other websites or books that would be a good place to look further into this for those who are interested?
Yes.
You mentioned Ian McGilchrist.
Yeah, you could look up Ian McGilchrist. There's in terms of finding out the range of voices out there, there's a set of videos called Closer to Truth. You could Google someone like David Chalmers. He's got very interesting things to say. Justin Brierley has there's an interview between Anil Seth, who's a neuroscientist at the University of Sussex, and Ian McGilchrist.
Yes, that's on the Uncommon Ground
Uncommon
podcast,
Ground,
isn't it?
yeah, that's quite a good
Very
place.
recent, yeah. Well, there are loads more questions, but I'm afraid we're out of time. So you've clearly stimulated an awful lot of conscious thought from people in the room. So, Sharon, thank you so much for an excellent presentation and really getting us thinking. Thank you.
Thank you.